So I am going to be talking really kind of about your cloud options, which is a huge part of kind of what I do over here at Estes. And I spend, I would say, most of my days running through what's the best solution for the customer, what issues are you running into. Did my screen come up okay? Perfect. Perfect. So it's really about kind of understanding your options for cloud and everything that entails. And so one of the big things is general considerations for your environment, which is how are you guys configured today? How are you guys configured today? How are you guys currently leveraging your system? And it really comes down to a couple of factors as far as the application or what you guys are doing today for your backend systems. So one of those are key business drivers such as functionality and capabilities, flexibility, scalability, and customization, access control, integration needs. The next section can really be broken out as cost, which is a huge consideration, especially with the poll that you guys all voted on, that most of you are on-prem. It comes down to capital expense versus an operation expense. So if you're doing a capital expense, you're probably used to your on-prem environment. And then looking at kind of the cloud or SaaS option is definitely more of an operating expense. So it comes down to each business of what's going to fit their business model the best. A fixed cost or kind of a variable cost, depending on how you guys are structured. Another huge consideration with cost, which we see very much with cloud solutions, especially primarily in the Azure environment, is ingress and egress costs. So when you're transferring data in or out, it can definitely add to those additional costs, which might not be best for your business, depending on how you are configured. And then really kind of the last consideration for your cloud ERP options are data center requirements. Not all data centers are created equal. A lot of people talk about the big three, which is considered AWS, Azure, and then if you have any private data centers out there. So one of the big questions that I discuss with a lot of businesses, whether we're talking about or any Epicor product and whether cloud is a good fit for your business, is what are your compliance requirements? If you're in the manufacturing space, do you have to be CMMC compliant, NIST 800 because of the contracts that you have for those manufacturing lines of business? The other piece to consider when you're looking at data center requirements is reliability and uptime SLAs. I would say that the last component is really performance requirements, which are pretty standardized across the industry when you're looking kind of at cloud environments. And that's where you get into really the different options when it comes to the solution sets out there. So there's primarily SaaS, there is infrastructure as a service, and there's really PaaS. So we'll discuss kind of software as a service first. So this is really kind of your subscription model, ERP application basis, Salesforce, the E10 application can be cloud hosted or SaaS hosted, as well as P21. So it pretty much means that you are purchasing monthly. Sometimes you can pay that in an annual fee, but you're basically purchasing the software and your costs are as they are consumed. One of the big issues when you start looking at a SaaS solution, especially with the Epicor products, is you're kind of in a shared tenant, generally speaking, when you're looking at SaaS. So you might have restricted access to your SQL tables, to APIs, any type of integrations or connections that you might have had in an on-premise model might not directly transfer over to a SaaS application. So it's great for customers who don't own hardware and they don't want to have that capital expense. They have limited IT staff. Sometimes SaaS will be a great fit for that. Or you might just be getting into the ERP space and you don't necessarily have a lot of third-party integrations or customization. SaaS is definitely a decent fit. Now, with that, I will say SaaS can also have its troubles. If you are an established business and you are looking to do a on-prem refresh of hardware and have that capital expense, but you're also looking at your cloud options, SaaS doesn't necessarily integrate very well with people that have an established business model because you have restricted access when you go to the SaaS solution with all of your information. So it can break your APIs, your third-party integrations, and there's a lot of upfront work. Being in this space, I've worked with several customers where they went to the SaaS model for some of the Epicor products, and it ended up being over almost 10 months of integration, and they still don't actually have a live environment. So SaaS is great for certain businesses, but it's also very restrictive for others. So the next kind of solution of how Epicor is deployed is really an on-premise install. Sounds like most of you are familiar with that here. Basically, you own your hardware. Generally, what I see from speaking with customers is they'll purchase a server. They usually do the expense over 5 years. So they'll do a 3-year next business day warranty on a new purchase, and then they'll usually do a 2 or 3 year extension. That's pretty common for the on-premise portion. Basically, you own your licenses and you own all of that cost. So it's great for people that have internal IT and those expertise in-house. It definitely works. I would say that when you're looking at on-prem kind of versus the SaaS solution, SaaS definitely has scalability and flexibility, probably a little bit more reliable unless you have a very extensive on-prem network, including backups, a DRaaS solution, all of that functionality. One sec. Perfect. So next is really your private cloud or infrastructure as a service. I would say that this is a big area where I spend a lot of my time talking to customers, whether it's with the Epicor product in E10 or Kinetic, or you're looking at P21 on the flip side. So infrastructure as a service is basically we stand up the resources and allow you to have kind of that platform, and you manage it from the application to the patch management to the hardware. Kind of the ball's in your court once the environment stood up. So it's a great fit because it keeps your costs down, and it's much more comparable to on-prem from a pricing standpoint if you're looking at ROIs. So pretty much you're responsible for the entire administration of the application and the infrastructure. But generally, when we set up infrastructure as a service, we're still there on the back end. So if you need additional assistance, you can still submit tickets through us, and you still have the support. It's just all billable at that point. So it's great for customers that don't necessarily want to stay on-prem. Infrastructure as a service works great for multi-site locations. So you don't have a single point of failure like an on-prem environment. So those are the advantage of infrastructure as a service. As long as you have a good internet connection at your facilities, this is definitely a great option. So then we move into PaaS, so platform as a service. This is basically infrastructure as a service. We stand up the application, but then we manage all of the hardware and all of the infrastructure that goes with that. It's great for customers that are have IT departments where they don't have enough time to complete all the projects that they currently want. They want to offload some of that work. It uses the same thing, perpetual license model, so the ERP application license separate from the rest of the platform, but it basically allows companies to convert their hardware and data center costs into operating expenses. It's also great for scalability. It allows that multi-site environment to really function well. So you don't have to manage the hardware. You basically are responsible for the application. We can still assist with that and still have that functionality. But this is, I would say, where I probably spend 60% of my conversations is talking about with our customers or prospects, private cloud PaaS or infrastructure as a service seem to be a great fit. It's very similar to the on-prem environment. You have all of the functionality. You have full access for APIs, integrations, VPNs, anything that you need in the environment, you pretty much have access to. So it mirrors pretty much an on-prem environment. It's now just up in the cloud, and you have not a single point of failure moving forward. So this is basically kind of a responsibility matrix or outlay from on-premise all the way up to software as a service. So I really end up playing in that middle space because that's what really fits well. for most customers that we end up talking to is they're looking to offload, whether it's a portion or all of it, as far as some of those system and hosting requirements. And so this is kind of how it scales. So I mentioned at the beginning that not all data centers are created equal. I come from a background where I actually used to work with a distributor, cloud distributor. So I am very familiar with the AWS and Azure platforms. They're not terrible options. Everyone has their unique hurdles and challenges when it comes to cloud. These are some of the highlights about working with a private data center provider. It's not actually our hardware. We work and leverage a company called US Signal. So we're very transparent about who we host with, but they've got 8 data centers. They sit on private fiber between all 8 data centers. So you actually have access to 2 data centers when you host a solution with us. So you have that functionality and failover capability in case there is an event at the primary data center. It's also the only private cloud or public cloud that I've ever seen that will write a guaranteed 100% SLA on the hardware, meaning that they will literally put it in writing that you will not go down to hardware requirements. They also have a lot of compliances that they check off: HIPAA, SOC 1, 2, PCI, FBI, CGIS, which is a very rare cert. You don't find that at a lot of data centers. NIST 800, GDRP, ITAR, and they are currently in the process of CMMC certifications right now. Everyone kind of in the data center world is running through that as there are not enough auditors. So they have done the self-audit and they are already NIST 800. So it's basically that compliance, just one more level. They also have 24/7 by 365 NOC, and you will get a guaranteed engineer on the line when you call within 60 seconds. So this is huge from a support standpoint. If you've ever worked with any of the other cloud providers, such as Microsoft or AWS, you definitely can run into the issue of not being able to get somebody on the phone when you need them. And so it's a great solution. And whether you're infrastructure as a service or PaaS with Estes, you still can have access to that layer of support. Another reason why we end up going with that data center provider is it's very key when you pick a partner of where your data center is located. Generally speaking, they try to put them out of natural disaster areas. The next slide is where the actual data centers reside. So like you said, 8 geodiverse data centers. They are running Cisco clusters. So they get audited 6 times annually in order to hold their Cisco certification. But like I said, this is how they do that 100% SLA. They've got 8 data centers. They sit on private fiber between all 8 data centers, so they do not have to go over public lines to stand you up in the failover data center if required. So as I mentioned earlier, they are Cisco certified, but basically we can do everything from any type of infrastructure or Hyper-V we can pretty much move from over to our infrastructure as a service or platform as a service. And here is some of the additional offerings that our partner also offers. So they are a Veeam partner. That's primarily what they use for backup, but they have backup as a service, they have DRaaS as a service, and they can also do managed backups. Probably the most unique thing that I think that's worth speaking about here is their DRaaS solution, or disaster recovery as a service, is probably one of the most affordable that I've seen in the market. Generally, when you're looking at your infrastructure and we're kind of discussing what's right for your business, a lot of larger companies will start to implement a disaster recovery solution. And usually when you design that, you have to pay for your resources to have that failover depending on what your RTO is. Specifically with US Signal, you just pay for the actual storage. You do not pay for any additional resources for CPU, RAM, etc. So it's very affordable when you're looking for that as an option. Their DRaaS solution also comes with air-gapped backups, which if you're looking at how do you reduce ransomware, that's one of the key pieces. If you have a disaster recovery solution, it's one step better than backup, because as they replicate to an alternate data center for the DRaaS solution, they change the files from a bootable file to something that cannot be booted up or read. And so it allows ransomware not to get in, even if it gets into the data center, it does not see it as a file that it can actually ransomware. So that's probably one of the biggest things that I have been discussing with most of our customers is kind of what does that look like cost-wise, and is it the right fit for your organization? They also do professional services for data transfers. So we try to make it ridiculously easy over here at the EstesGroup of how you migrate. So generally speaking, unless you are doing a pickup, lift, and move from an on-prem solution to cloud, there are no migration costs. If you are doing a Zerto replication, so you're basically picking up all of your on-prem data and you're not configuring new servers, they have a professional service department that can assist you with that, so they can do the heavy lifting for you. So as I was mentioning earlier, we can do everything from migration of servers from VMware, Hyper-V, XN server hypervisors. We can also do all Windows, Linux, almost any OS, but basically both physical and virtual environments. So it's pretty much a white glove experience from start to finish. So if you don't have the internal staff, and that might be one of the reasons why you haven't looked at cloud, it's definitely worth taking another look. Oh. And this is where I'm going to turn it over to Daryl Sirota, which I'm sure you are all familiar with.
Well, I thank you, Chris. Appreciate the fine introduction. Greetings, everyone. My name, as implied, is stated, is Daryl. I'm the VP of Technology here at the EstesGroup. Been doing fun cloud stuff for way too many years, and I wanted to share with you some of the high-level benefits of moving to a cloud environment if you're not already, and some of the pros and cons, and regardless of whether you're moving to a private cloud or a public cloud or something in between there's a lot of different options and some things that you want to keep your eye on to make sure that your servers are running as efficient as possible. So with that, I'm going to go ahead here and share out a little bit of detail. I'm trying not to make this death by PowerPoint. So if you have any questions as I go along, please feel free to post them in the chat. I am monitoring it over here on another monitor. So if I glance over here occasionally, it's not because I'm ignoring you, it's because I'm making sure that there's no questions here in the chat. But feel free to use the chat window or the Q&A window to ask any questions as you have them. Okay, so first thing, keep in mind that cloud is not a magic term. It really just means somebody else's computer. So when you look at a cloud environment, keep in mind that it's still probably Intel processors running a Windows operating system with the same IIS and SQL and bits that are running underneath. In fact, if you're running on-prem, as 81% of you are, those same functions and requirements apply to the cloud solution. So this isn't some magic solution that all of your problems are transported to the cloud and you don't have to worry about them, but rather those solutions are transported, moved, copied, sometimes upgraded into somebody else's computer. So when we look at the different cloud environments or the architectures, there's two primary architectures that we kind of split things in. There's a dedicated architecture, and this is where the resources that you are consuming are dedicated to you. So in some cases, that's a dedicated operating system, dedicated SQL, dedicated firewall, network pipe, and all those things. And in many cases, that dedicated environment gives you that consistent interface, the consistent performance that some clients are looking for. On the other side, you might decide that cost savings are more important. And what we can do is look at a shared tenant environment. And this is where we share some of the infrastructure, maybe a common network pipe, a common Active Directory structure, common SQL servers, although SQL instances are dedicated to each of our clients. But basically what this allows us to do is lower the cost so that we can, bring a more cost-effective solution to you, and it does help minimize some of the overhead requirements. And regardless of whether you're on a dedicated environment or a shared tenant environment, there's a couple of different ways to look at this. So the first one is where most of you probably are now, and that is what I call the on-premise cloud. Really, this is you're running on your own hardware. It's you're running some type of a hypervisor. So most folks are running VMware. Some folks are running Hyper-V. There are some other virtualization platforms out there. But as soon as you go to that level of virtualization, you could spin up new servers and add memory and add disk and do all of those things relatively easily until, of course, you run out of memory or run out of disk space, and then you have to go hurry up and buy some more. And essentially what you end up doing is owning that environment, right? So you own, purchase, and own and repair the hardware, the configuration, all of the servers, the licenses for the Windows and the SQL and the terminal servers and everything, and Epicor, and you own the application, right? So it's basically your on-prem environment. It's just a private cloud or on-premise cloud, as it's often referred to. And of course, that's a dedicated environment. Presumably, your on-premise private cloud environment is dedicated to just Epicor. Well, probably not. If some of you folks run on-prem servers with Epicor, you probably have it sharing with a little bit of Exchange, maybe a little bit of SharePoint, a couple of domain controllers over there in another virtual world. So the reality is that even if you run your own on-premise cloud, it's not likely dedicated to the Epicor application, but rather it's sharing, because you spent a lot of money on that SAN, it's sharing it with other on-premise file servers, SQL servers, print servers, et cetera, et cetera. And so that way the private cloud environment actually turns into a shared tenant, even though it's all just you, but you're sharing it with those other functions. So then when we look at the private cloud environment, the infrastructure and as a service, platform as a service, and our managed hosting, these kind of mishmash together into a private cloud solution that Chris was referring to earlier. And this really basically is where you don't own the hardware anymore, but rather you take all of those functions, whether you're just renting CPUs and RAM in the infrastructure as a service, or you go through the whole managed hosting environment where not only do we help you with the operating system and the SQL application and the Epicor install and running all of the stuff that you run on top of Epicor, all those third-party plugins, et cetera. That all is running in our data center rather than sitting in your, so I'm gonna say server closet. So I know some of you do have server closets. I've seen them, but most of the folks that are in this in the enterprise class, you have a server room that you get to pay to power and you get to pay to cool and you get to pay to repair. So all of those benefits come with the outsourcing all of that cloud environment to a hosting provider such as EstesGroup. Lastly, of course, we do have the public cloud environment is kind of the ultimate and shared tenancy. And this is where you have the SaaS solution or software as a service, where basically all you do is you purchase per seat licensing. And you really don't have a say in where your data lives or who else is playing along for the ride. You're operating in a big shared environment. And for example, Microsoft Office 365 is a classic example of software as a service. So as you run your email in Office 365, you've got you don't know where your mail server is, and unless you're in the government organization, you have to keep it within the U.S. borders. You don't know, nor do you really care when they upgrade Exchange servers or move your mailbox from point A to point B. So these are all different benefits of using somebody else's computer. So let's look a little bit more in detail now what it takes to run, in fact, the Kinetic Epicor environment in that cloud solution, regardless of which cloud solution you pick. So we have a couple of characteristics. First off, you will note that Epicor has always supported a specific platform. Operating system and SQLs are matched together, and you can't just pick willy-nilly and expect Epicor to support you. So you can run Server 2012 R2, no more 2008. With SQL 2017, no more SQL 16. Or Server 16 with SQL 17, or you can even go up to Windows Server 19. Yay, that's supported. Server 22 is not yet supported. So for those of you on the bleeding edge of Microsoft operating systems, hold off. Windows 11 isn't supported either. So just cool your jets if you're trying to go to that. SQL 19 is only supported with Server 19. So those are some of the supported stacks that are the 3 supported stacks that Epicor will support you on as you move to Kinetic. Of course, it requires the .NET 4.8 framework. This is usually not an issue unless you're forgot to install it on all your workstations. Most Windows 10 machines now have that patched up and they're not an issue. You do require SQL reporting services. Now, a SQL reporting services, when they move to SQL 17, is a separate download, and it can use the same license key as your SQL engine. However, you have to keep in mind that there are some licensing nuances, which I'll get to in another slide here. But SQL reporting services, separate download, got to have your license key, and that's kind of cool. But that's it's got some caveats, as again I'll discuss shortly. You also need SQL full text search. Not a big deal, but if you want your Epicor search to work properly, then SQL full text search has to be turned on. It's just a bit you flip. There's no extra money for that SQL full text search functionality. So once you get those server requirements together, then we move on to the SQL licensing. So Microsoft, of course, their SQL licensing is either a SQL 2017 or SQL 2019 standard or enterprise edition licenses. So the standard edition is the less expensive of the two, obviously, but it does have some limitations. For example, it cannot do online index rebuilds. And you might say, well, who cares about that, right? Online, you just do offline index rebuilds. Sure, if you want to do an offline index rebuild with SQL Standard Edition, then stop your task agent, kick all your users out, shut down the Epicor application server, and then you can do your full index rebuilds, which is a kind of a showstopper if you're a 24/7 shop. And most folks run MRPs and things like that in the middle of the night, so you don't want to shut down your SQL server just so that you can get this reindex done. Also, in the Enterprise Edition, they have multiple databases in this thing called an always-on availability group. It's one of the high availability features that Microsoft built into the SQL product. With SQL Standard Edition, you get one database per availability group. That means you can build a cluster, and you have your database living on server A, and if something happens to server A, then the database fails over server B. Now, users do get a service interruption. They'll get an error message. SQL stops on one, it starts on the other, but your database comes back online, usually within a minute. And that's one way that you can achieve high availability without spending a whole lot of money. The problem is that Epicor solutions often involve more than one database. And so you want to have not only your production database, but your search database and your bartender database and your e-commerce database. All those you probably fail over as a chunk rather than one off. So that's where Enterprise Edition comes in handy. And then there's another huge benefit of Enterprise Edition, and that is those always-on availability groups are available to be read-only. So you can actually run your SSRS reporting off of a separate SQL instance than running SSRS off of your production instance. And what that does is it improves performance, it splits the IO. There's a lot of benefits to splitting your data processing from your decision support in a high transactional environment. SQL is licensed. You have to have a minimum of 4 cores, even in the virtual environment, and you bump them by 2 core packs. So I have seen clients where they want to make it go faster. So they start adding CPUs to the SQL server. And the technicians will do that because it's easy to go into a virtualized world and just add another CPU, add another CPU. Did it go faster? If it didn't go faster, they don't often take the CPUs away. And that creates a headache when it comes to the licensing guys, because they'll look at that and every 2 cores requires another license pack. And in the Enterprise Edition SQL world, that's a 4 or 5 figure number depending on your licensing agreement. So just simply licensing SQL to do your job could be a significant chunk of change. Now, one thing that also is catches some folks is they'll install the SQL engine on one server and they'll install SSRS on another server. Those 2 functions, when they're on the same server, can piggyback on the same license. So you buy a 4-core license of SQL and you can run the engine and SSRS on the same OS. But if you split them apart because you want to get better performance or higher availability, etc., now this server requires 4 cores and that server requires 4-core licenses. So you've just doubled your licensing costs by splitting the two servers into splitting those functions into two separate servers. So keep in mind that that can be a challenge. You must license the number of processors that are presented to SQL. So you can't present 12 processors to SQL and say, I want to give 4 to the engine, and I want to give 4 to SSRS, and I want 4 for it to be able to run, I don't know, my backups, something like that. Microsoft looks at the number of processors that are presented. We call them cores or processors kind of interchangeably. And whatever's presented to SQL, that's what the licensing experts are going to come down to your door and go, show me your licenses, because you have to make sure you're obviously in license compliance with Microsoft. One of the nice things about SQL is it's always offered additional instances on the same VM. So if you wanted to have a production SQL Server instance on one machine, and on that same box install a separate instance for your test environment, that's legit, and you can do that without paying Microsoft extra money. However, Microsoft did the industry a disservice, in my humble opinion, in that starting with SQL 2017, SSRS can no longer be multi-instance on the same operating system. That means you can only install one SSRS. There's only one engine that's running your reports. If you're running reports in production and test on the same server, you're running that all in the same SSRS instance. And that could potentially let test environment impact the production environment. And some of the folks out there are very, very much purists when it comes to splitting testing from production. So if you're going to absolutely split testing from production, you're going to have 2 separate SQL servers, one running the production engine, production SSRS, and a completely other box that's running the test engine and the test SSRS. So those are some benefits that you have. And just want to keep in mind that the SQL licensing is certainly going to be a factor as we look at that. Okay, remote desktop, similar animal here. If you're running terminal servers and in the cloud environment, you're most likely going to be moving, you've either got terminal servers there, and we'll be migrating those functions into, and that terminal services into the cloud environment, or you're working really hard to get away from the terminal services environment, and you look at this new thing called Kinetic and go, wow, Kinetic has a web UI. And we can go through and we can eliminate or minimize the use of terminal services by moving to the web UI. And this is true in not only the E10 environment, but also the Kinetic environment. And for those folks running Prophet 21, same scenario. Epicor is pushing folks fast and furious to the web environment. The benefit there is you don't need terminal servers, which is great because terminal servers, they're big bad servers. If you're running more than 40 or 50 users, you're probably going to need more than one terminal server, and that's a terminal server farm. And every one of those users needs their own license. So you need to purchase your own license, or if you host it in our cloud environment, we have a service provider license, and basically you can rent that terminal server license on a monthly basis. Same thing true with the SQL licenses, by the way. You basically rent them month to month as needed, and that's where you can increase or potentially decrease your usage of licenses without having a big cash outlay. Another benefit of going to the cloud environment. So when you go to the web access, again, it simply uses IIS, and it doesn't need any separate licensing. So you can have license the operating system, and then of course you're going to license Epicor, the application, but you're not going to have to license SQL, but you're going to not have to run the RDP farm with RDP licenses. So lots of benefits and options there, whether you're running the pure Kinetic interface from the web browser. Kinetic still supports what they call classic web access and classic mobile access. These are browser interfaces, scaled down, not as pretty, not as functional, but that's what's kind of a legacy environment. And then the Prophet 21 environment with their web UI looks very different than the legacy client, but available and simpler to deploy. When you take that smart client, or the Epicor fat client, smart client, legacy client, classic client, call it what you will, and you install it locally on a PC at your environment, instead of using terminal services, what you might find is that you're going to introduce some networking bottlenecks. That is, you're moving a lot of the data across the VPN tunnel from the cloud environment down to your on-premise environment. instead of a terminal server or a web client that's designed to be light, it's designed to be internet friendly. The smart client install will bring down all of your customers when you query a list of all your customers. It'll bring down all of the orders or all of the ship tos down to your workstation rather than the subset, or in the case of terminal services, the just the screen images or the keystrokes necessary to support the terminal server environment. So as you can probably see, there's a lot of questions, a lot of concerns, a lot of potential issues that are brought up when we decide, do you want to do RDP or do you want to do the new web UI environment? And a lot of clients actually have a mix and match, especially as we move into the Kinetic world where the web Kinetic interface is more robust than the old classic web interface. You might have some users that are comfortable in the web UI and some folks that still need that legacy smart client experience. So you'll have some mix and match depending on your audience. Okay, no questions so far, so I'm going to ramble on here. Of course, ERP performance is important. You need to make sure that whatever systems you stand up, that you have sufficient resources, right? CPU, memory, disk, and network performance is critical to any server. So whether it's your SQL server, your Kinetic application server, the terminal server, the remote desktop servers that you're running, do keep in mind that the Kinetic UI, if you are running it on a terminal server environment, uses more RAM. So for folks that are starting to use the Kinetic interface, even in E10, you will see that that terminal server or even the smart client installed on the workstation does use a little bit more RAM. And so keep that in mind. If you're planning to upgrade from E10 to Kinetic, your terminal servers will probably need a corresponding memory upgrade. So when you look at that ERP performance, a lot of folks, when I ask this question, well, how's your ERP performing today? What they'll do is they'll go to the application server and they'll pop up Task Manager. If they're advanced, they'll look at Resource Manager. If they're super advanced, they'll look at Performance Monitor and they'll go, well, CPU is sitting at about 15%, so I don't have a CPU bottleneck. And that's might be okay for that split second that you're looking at Performance Monitor or Task Manager. But the reality is that your ERP performance is more than just a snapshot of the 60 seconds that Task Manager gives you. It's a longer term trend, right? Is your ERP system slower at 9 o'clock in the morning when the doors open and everybody rushes in to buy stuff? Is it slower at lunchtime when people are trying to get all their work done before they go out to lunch? Is it super fast on the weekends because there's nobody there? So these are the types of questions that we can look at with a longer term trending tool. So Performance Monitor does have this trend where you can monitor for more than 60 seconds or a couple of minutes. But it takes a fairly advanced engineer to go into Performance Monitor and look at the counters, the functions that you're interested in watching over that long-term trend. So you can use Performance Monitor. We here at the EstesGroup, we prefer to use third-party tools because third-party tools really provide a much deeper insight into how is your server feeling, not only today, not only at this moment, but over the course of a month or 2 months. So as you add users or change a module or move from the RDP interface to the web interface, we can see what the impact is on those CPU, memory, network, and disk channels to make sure that we're not going to bottleneck anything and that we can appropriately scale the solution. So third-party tools, lots of great tools there. I'll show you a couple of screenshots as we go down. But you have to make sure that, of course, you don't want an ERP that performs slower than it does today, right? And we see this a lot when we look at cloud migrations. A client will say, I have to make it go faster. And so what we'll do is we'll monitor your on-prem solution, if that makes sense. And we'll make sure that, the time to get a customer is equal to or better than your on-prem solution. The cloud solution is equal to or better than your on-prem solution. So SQL performance. So for your bit brains out there, the SQL engineers, you're probably familiar with some of this. I don't want to dive into lots of details, but the SQL server is the core of any ERP system. whether it's Kinetic or whether it's P21, or there's lots of other ERP systems out there. And if they're using SQL as their backend, most of them do, index maintenance, making sure that concurrent activities are kept to a minimum. You don't want to be running big MRP runs in the middle of the day when users are trying to do new data entry. Or if you have to do an MRP run, ask Brad. He can tell you how to do like a minimal ERP run to get the orders done, the ordering done that you need, and not just a full MRP run. There's two great tools out there that I wanted to share with you. The Brent Ozar is I haven't had the pleasure of meeting this gentleman, but he does a great SQL dive and creates this thing called a check, a blitz check, excuse me. The blitz check, it simply is a sanity check of your SQL server, whether your SQL server is on-prem or it's in your private cloud. You can't do it in the SaaS environment because they don't let you at the SQL server. But Brent Ozar will come along and say, hey, did you know that you haven't done a backup of this database in 6 months? Some people look at that and go, well, that's crazy because I thought I was backing up nightly. Well, you might have some databases. It does one of those. It's like 500 different checks just to make sure that your SQL servers, you're just not going insane with stupid user tricks. And I've seen plenty of stupid user tricks on SQL servers. If you're willing to spend a little bit of money on some monitoring for SQL, Quest software makes a Spotlight.io monitoring tool that will show you everything that you want to know about your SQL server and more, as well as suggestions to make it go faster. So SQL performance, certainly one of the things that we spend a lot of time on in the Echo hosting environment. So when we look at the ERP environment, of course, security comes paramount. I've beaten this drum time and again, so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this slide, short of the fact that if you decide not to decide on any one of these factors, then you've already decided that you're going to ignore it. So that if you don't look at account management, for example, then when one of your folks leaves the company and you forgot to disable their account, or they walked out the door knowing the ERP service account or your Epicor manager account. Account management is kind of critical to make sure that you don't have bad people, usually ex-employees, playing in. Of course, we all know what the default Epicor password is, right? Manager. I still see clients running the manager username with the manager password. And I just try to shake my head. I tell them, go, you can't do this because every person in the world, even that new hire that's walking in the door who ran Epicor in the last shop, they know manager. So account management, absolutely critical. So one of the big things we see in the cloud space is that disaster recovery, being able to define your recovery time objective and your recovery point objective. These are two critical acronyms that if you're not familiar with, catch me during open question time, I'll tell you more about them. But one of the biggest challenges in a small environment is that here's your Epicor server, it's running, yeah, you do a backup, but have you ever done a full disaster recovery of your on-prem environment? That is, you came into the office one day and the server is a smoking crater in the ground, and nobody's in Epicor because the servers, got little curls of smoke going up. How long is it going to take you to get Epicor back and running so that you can produce products? If it takes less than, if you've never done that test, and it takes less than 3 days, you're doing good. Now, I don't know about you, but most folks don't like to be down for 3 days. So the disaster recovery aspect of our hosting environment really is kind of top notch. And that is one of the key factors in moving to a mature environment where you can click a button and know that your data is now running 50 miles away in another data center. And we can put our money where our mouth is, and we actually offer 2 free fire drills a year in that failover environment. So it's not just setting it up and pretending that's work, it's we prove it. Okay, so when we look at this, our preferred data center, if you will, this is our high-level snapshot of 2 data centers. Virtual data center 1 is on one power grid, the Western power grid, and the other data centers on the Eastern power grid. So, if heaven forbid New York goes out, the other data center is still running. And so these are a high-level picture of what the data centers, if it were, look like, so that when you purchase the EstesCloud hosting environment, or infrastructure as a service, these are the options that are immediately available to you. And Chris went over some of the details on that. So with that, we really want to make sure that as you do monitoring and you're watching your Epicor, I just grabbed a couple of screenshots. These are two of the dashboards that my team looks at all day long to see which one's red, which one's orange, and where's the green. And this monitors not only CPU and network and disk, but it also measures things like patch management, antivirus updates, software updates, and things like that. So without going into any of the details on the dashboards, if you don't have a dashboard on your Epicor system, chances are you're kind of running blind. So I want to make sure that if necessary, we can put these kind of eyeballs on your servers if you choose to stay on-prem. We can put these eyeballs in Azure, or we can put them up in our cloud environment as well. So with that, I am going to say thanks so much for the time. I did go over a little bit, so I'm going to open the door for a couple of questions here and give a chance for a little bit of break here. So, questions. The first question is, I have a full IT staff and plan on keeping them. Can we manage the app server in a hosted environment? Absolutely. And we see that a lot for those folks that are doing infrastructure as a service. You want to keep your IT staff, you just don't want to keep your servers, by all means. And that's really where the infrastructure, you just put your servers up in the cloud and your staff has complete access, administrative access to those boxes. You just have a different IP address, that's all. Okay.
Hey, and Daryl, we had
yes.
an incoming question that I wanted to make sure we answered live. We have a recording of this. I think it will. Oh, I'm so sorry. I thought it wasn't a question. I'm sorry. Ignore me.
That's okay. So that was one question. Let's see. Several third-party integrations through ODBC. Will they work in a private cloud? Yes, they will. I say it like that because ODBC is not a great solution because it's old technology. But yes, if you got Excel spreadsheets and homegrown code that runs over ODBC drivers, you can absolutely run it with integrated Windows authentication, or you can run it with standard SQL authentication. But most of our clients, hosted clients, still run ODBC. As much as I tell them to get out of that ODBC world, it's legacy and it's been out there for a long time. So absolutely, ODBC still works.
Daryl, this has really been great. I've learned a lot just watching it, and having worked with Epicor in the past as an IT director, it's great information for me too, particularly about all the new versions and requirements there. Thanks for sharing all of that.
Absolutely. So if there's any other questions, go ahead and post them. I'm going to give you guys a chance for that bio break because that was bad of me. I ran 5 minutes over. So sorry for that.
Okay.
Appreciate all your questions, and I'll be here throughout the presentation and during other break times as well. So thanks so much for your time, and we'll be seeing you on the other side.